So that's our game Lock and Loaf. It's lacking in a lot of feedback. It's just got sound effects and particle effects at the moment, and that's due to my team member having, unfortunately, some personal commitments outside of school. So I was pretty well by myself in the last 2 weeks. In the first week, we concepted together, and Paul made all of the pretty models in Magic of Voxel that you see there. But yeah, I'll get to that in a second. I want to start with what went well, and that was the concepting. In the first few days of this project, we made a lot of iterations. We refined the concepts a lot. It was very different to start off with, and every decision we made considering the target platform and the time that we had to make it, as well as our skills. We were honest about our strengths and weaknesses when we had our first team meeting. Paul even asked if we could do the scripting together so that he could become more familiar with the process, because he doesn't have a lot of experience. I did have to catch up on a lot of learning outcomes in this last week, so I wasn't able to really spend some time polishing it up. But the idea is there, and all the framework enables us to expand upon it quite easily, which is part of what went wrong, actually. I spent a lot of time ensuring that the scripts were modular and expandable and elegant, and because I was the only one working on it, I could have spent that time throwing together some spaghetti code that just worked because I was the only one that needed to understand it. Part of the reason I continued spending so much time on the framework was because we weren't sure how much Paul would be contributing. His personal stuff was kind of up in the air, and I think it would have been a much better idea if we just said, okay, you've got this thing, so I'm just gonna do this myself, and if you can do anything else, cool, just let me know. But because things were up in the air, I kind of went about it as if I was going to have someone else working on this, but unfortunately it didn't happen. So I did have to do a bunch of overtime because I do obsess about having a finished playable project. Yeah, so concept's cool. We did a really good job together coming up with the concept early on, but unfortunately I spent too long on the framework, which I guess I should show you a little bit of, because I've learned a few interesting things. I've tried a few new things as well. This is my event manager, so these are all the interactions that happen in the game. And where I usually create a custom data class, here I'm only I'm declaring a new class that inherits from Unity event but takes in a type. This one takes in a string, so I know what button is pressed, for example. Ingredient collision takes in an ingredient and a bread that collided with it, so I can get all of the class-specific information from those things when that happens. So the sound manager can play a different sound based on the ingredient or the bread, and the particle manager can play different particle effects with different colors based on the ingredients being hit, their type potentially. And the GUI manager, which I don't actually have one of at the moment, could pop up some text based on the ingredient that was hit. By looking at its nutrition value, perhaps it would pop that up. So you would have more feedback for the score than just that text at the top of the screen updating every time the bread collides. The other interesting thing that came to me working on this was that the sound manager listens to every one of the events. So if there's an interaction in your game, your sound manager is probably going to want to know about it because you might want some easy feedback. I mean, sound is really easy feedback. So I think in the future, I'm going to streamline my documentation by just writing all the events, the interactions that I can think of, and then starting with a sound manager, and any other class can just be a copy and paste of this, and I'll cut out any events I don't care about. The level generator, I tried a few different methods for reading our .csv files and converting them to a string so that we could split that string up into rows and columns, and then check what's left and spawn something depending on the code there. But it was resources.load being cast as a text asset that worked consistently on the computer and the Android, using shared resources or streaming, and what was the other one? I can't remember. There's another one I did that only worked on the computer but never on the Android. But casting as a text asset works great on both. It's really easy to understand what's going on there with that one line of code. It's just looking for a file name that's got the level index in it and the word level. That's a type of text asset, and so .csv is obviously a type of text asset because this returned all right. Next is the touch manager. This is a pretty universal script here. Steve taught me how to do this conditional here. I can emulate touch inputs with my mouse button. So I'm sending messages to a game object that cares to listen. When I click the mouse down, so I'm beginning a touch, and I hold the mouse and I release the mouse. So if I'm in the Unity editor, I can test everything just like you saw there in my playthrough. Otherwise, it handles touch quite elegantly. It just, for each touch in the array of touches in input, it's going to send a message to anything that cares to listen, taking in that position, the finger ID, and the phase that the touch is in. And we see them here in the send messages function, which just casts array to an object and gets that hit position, gets the game object that was hit and sends a message to it with the data that comes from the touch that started this message. So we can look at the bread controller and see that. So here are the touch messages. On touch began, I'm just setting the bread to is grabbed so that I can do a bunch of conditionals in the other messages, and invoking the event on bread grabbed. So this is the only thing listening to touches at the moment, but all I have to do is change the layer mask of any object to this touch input mask that I've set, and the thing is touchable. And so if it's got these functions in the class, they will run when it's touched, depending on how it's touched. So if I copy this touch manager and bread controller into any other Android game I make, I've got all this freedom of input, beginning the touch, moving the touch, and ending the touch. You don't really need on touch stay unless you're going to make a really simple, just tap or hold the screen and you can ignore moving. So I'm guessing like an endless runner is where I'll start using stay and begin and end. So here's some of my documentation. I've got the feature spec doc that broadly outlines how we're going to do the things, and then tech spec doc drills into that further with details on the technical implementation. And I list game objects and every component attached to them, as well as their tags, and in the future I'll probably have their layer masks so that I could use the touch manager and I wouldn't screw up by forgetting to change the layer mask of a certain object to make sure it's touchable. So I go over what each script will handle, and then the Unity events, what parameters they'll take, and what's going to invoke them, and what's going to listen to them. I think in the future I'm going to start with this after I get all the interactions nailed in the FSD. I'm just going to write all the interactions as events, thinking about what parameters they take, and I'm going to start writing code from the event manager as little as possible to get the actual game playing without any of the framework, because I have this problem where I tend to write all the framework and then hit play and debug for hours. So I've really got to stop doing that, especially if I lose my team members. So in summary, look to arcade games if you're making an Android game for their simple controls, and see or think about how you can tweak the mechanics just slightly to produce interesting and different behaviors. But keep your deadlines in mind. Streamline your documentation. Start with interactions. And separate the classes by the nouns, the things that are interacting. And the events are basically the verbs. So you can just write all the nouns that you use when you talk about your concept as the classes to begin with, and then the verbs interactions that they do can be every one of your events. You won't have too many, and you'll have control. You'll have modular control without any spaghetti code, which falls apart so easy. And don't leave things up in the air. That could be anything, not just a team member's commitment to the project. But if something's going on, I mean, you can always make up marks with a personal project. So yeah, that's my Lock and Loaf Post-Mortem. If you have any other questions about the project, please hit me up in the comments. Thank you.